everyone. I'm Another View producer Lisa Godley in for Barbara Ham Lee. It's called redlining. It was a practice started near the end of the Great Depression that shaped the country's housing policy. The federal government graded neighborhoods based on their racial makeup. The zoning map showed all white communities in green. Those communities were given an A grade, while all black neighborhoods were colored red and automatically received a D grade, even if their homes looked exactly alike. Grade A communities were eligible for federally insured mortgages, but Grade D communities were never even considered. The result, neighborhoods that became and remain mostly segregated, and a wealth gap that's still in place today. We'll discuss the results of redlining right after this news from NPR.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Another View producer Lisa Godley in for Barbara Ham Lee. Let's get right to it. Redlining made living in segregated neighborhoods an economically sound decision for white Americans. With a Grade A zoning rating that was only given to all white neighborhoods, they could get low-interest loans, build equity in their home, and eventually sell, if they so desired, for a huge profit, whereas African Americans did not have that option. They could not get the loans because their communities were red zoned, given a D rating, which meant high risk, simply because of the color of their skin, even if their home mirrored a home in a Grade A community. We have a stellar panel of guests this afternoon, and I'd like to introduce them to you. We have Dr. Johnny Finn, Associate Professor of Geography at Christopher Newport University. Johnny, welcome to Another View.
Thank you very much.
Also joining us is Dr. Sharon Alston, who is an assistant professor of social work at Norfolk State University. Sharon grew up in public housing and has studied how its impact affects a person mentally. Sharon, welcome to Another View.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to this courageous conversation.
All right, me too. And finally, Joe Dillard, a commissioner with Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority. Joe, welcome back to Another View.
Hey, Lisa. Great to see you. I know we're not in the studio, but it's always good to be with you.
All right. But before we get into our local components, I want to introduce a very special guest, the author of The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein. I have been engrossed in this book for the past couple of days, and I just want to say thank you so much for joining the conversation today and get in the point of getting right to it. In The Color of Law, we see that African Americans weren't really given a lot of options when it came to housing, and how public housing in a lot of cases became their only option. But I'd like you to take a few minutes and delve into the history, because a lot of people believe that public housing was created for lower income African Americans from the start.
Yes, you're absolutely right. We have a widespread misconception that public housing is something for poor people, disproportionately African Americans, and in some areas of the country, Hispanics. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began during the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration, during the Depression. Poor people weren't permitted into public housing. We had a 25% unemployment rate at the time. Public housing was for the 75% who had good jobs, who had stable incomes, who could show that they could pay the full cost of the rent. There were no subsidies for public housing. The Public Works Administration was the first New Deal agency to build public housing in this country. Everywhere it built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for whites, most of them for whites, and some for African Americans as well, but always segregated. Frequently, the public housing projects that were built in that period created segregation where it hadn't previously existed. We had many integrated downtown neighborhoods in the country, all across the country at that time, simply because most jobs were located in a central factory district. Factories needed to be located near a deep water port or a railroad terminal to get their parts and ship their final products. So African American and white workers all had to live close enough to walk to work. They didn't have cars, maybe short streetcar rides, so they lived broadly in the same neighborhoods. The Public Works Administration segregated those neighborhoods, sometimes for the first time, by building separate projects for blacks and whites. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes wrote in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend was Polish in high school. He said he dated a Jewish girl then. That's what you would expect to see in an integrated downtown neighborhood with an integrated downtown high school. But the Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood in Cleveland, built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to talk about self-satisfied smug places that may think they're better than you are in Virginia. The Public Works Administration went into the neighborhood between Harvard and MIT called the Central Square neighborhood in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half black and half white. But the Public Works Administration created segregation there by building a separate project for African Americans and a separate project for whites, and with those and other projects elsewhere, created segregation, perpetuated it in Massachusetts. During World War II, the pattern continued. Hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in aircraft carrier factories and shipyards and other defense plants. The government had to provide housing for them, and it did. Everywhere it built housing for war workers during World War II, it built it on a segregated basis, even though these workers were working in the same war plants. It frequently created segregation where it hadn't previously existed. That's how segregation came about on the West Coast, because there were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II. But the government segregated Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles with separate projects for blacks and whites that created segregation in those cities that otherwise would never have existed the way it does today. Our misunderstanding of this history is part of a national myth that we have, that what we've got is something we call de facto segregation, that it just sort of happened by accident because of private bigotry or banks and real estate agents, private businesses, or people liking to live with each other of the same race or because of income differences. And because we have this myth of de facto segregation, that it just happened by accident, we think that segregation can only unhappen by accident. But as the history of public housing shows, segregation in this country with this policy and many, many other racially explicit federal, state, and local policies is the reason we have segregation today. It's a constitutional violation. When the government segregated public housing, it was violating the 5th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. These are civil rights violations. Under our Constitution, we, all of us as American citizens, have an obligation to remedy it if we understand that this is government-created segregation, not de facto. Then it's incumbent upon all of us to take steps to undo it, to redress it, to make whole the victims and their descendants of these policies of segregation.
You in your book, you talk about other tactics that were also utilized to keep the races separate. And one example was the 1956 move by the Florida State Department to run I-95 through downtown and clear out almost an entire African-American community of about 40,000 people.
Well, yes, the national highway, the federal highway system that was created in the 1950s was another tactic that was used by federal and local governments to segregate the country. I believe, actually, the same thing happened in Richmond, although I'm not absolutely certain of that. But certainly in my book, I talk about the Miami example, where a I-95 was purposely routed to go through an African-American neighborhood for the purpose of displacing the residents there so they would have to move to a new segregated neighborhood much farther from downtown. And this went on in many, many parts of the country. One good example is Chicago. I don't know if you've ever been there, but the Dan Ryan Expressway was built for the purpose and routed for the purpose of separating black and white neighborhoods, making it more difficult for them to desegregate. This was another one of many, many explicit, racially explicit, unconstitutional federal, state, and local policies that gave us the segregation that we live with today.
Okay, one more question I really want to get into and get you to address a little. For those African Americans who dared to defy those rules and regulations, the consequences were usually violent. So could you share a little? You talk about it pretty extensively in your book.
Yes, certainly. There were hundreds and hundreds of cases in this country of African Americans who had legitimately purchased or rented homes in white neighborhoods, usually because African American neighborhoods were so overcrowded that African Americans were willing to pay more for housing in nearby white neighborhoods than whites were willing to pay. So it was in the interest of a white homeowner to sell his or her home to an African American. And when that happened, there were hundreds and hundreds of cases where police protected mob violence drove African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these, where the police were protecting it, was a civil rights violation. I give many examples of this in my book, The Color of Law, but one is Louisville, Kentucky, where a white homeowner in a single-family home, all-white community of Shively, a suburb of Louisville, had an African-American friend in the center city of Louisville. He was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and child, a good job, wanted to move to a single-family home. So the only way you could do it was if his white friend in this all-white suburb bought a second home and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved in, a angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They dynamited and firebombed the home, and the police made no effort to stop it. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. This is not de facto segregation. This is state-sponsored, state-organized violence designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another anywhere in this country. It was not just in border states like Louisville, like Kentucky. It was in Detroit and Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco, throughout the country. There were these examples of police-protected, sometimes even police-organized mob violence to drive African Americans out of their homes in predominantly white neighborhoods.
Wow, Richard, thank you so much. We really appreciate that. That's Richard Rothstein, the author of The Color of Law. I'm hoping you can hang out a little bit with us for the rest of the conversation. But if you can't, I most certainly understand. Johnny, I saw you shaking your head a couple of times when Richard was talking. A lot has happened over the last couple of decades. If you can afford it, you can live just about anywhere you want to live. But the racial geography here, especially right here in Hampton Roads, looks a lot like the redlining maps of the 1930s and 1940s. Why is that?
Right, sure. So first of all, I want to just say I was nodding my head in agreement, and I don't want people to think I was shaking my head in any disagreement with what Dr. Rothstein was talking about. But yeah, the map, the racial map, or the racial geography of Norfolk and indeed of all of Hampton Roads today really tightly resembles the 1940 so-called redlining map that was produced for this region in Norfolk, Portsmouth, Hampton, and Newport News. And a lot of that reason simply has to do with the biggest thing that racially segregated housing created, which is a massive racial wealth gap today. Recent data from the Federal Reserve for 2016 shows that the median white family income in the U.S. is about $171,000, whereas median black family wealth in the U.S. is only $17,000. So it's a 90% wealth gap between a median white family and a median black family. And that's the result of the cumulative effect of white families having their wealth through housing protected across nearly a century of racist housing policies, and not only having black families prohibited from accumulating that wealth through housing, but as you just heard Dr. Rothstein explain, having that wealth actively removed from them. We saw the race massacre in Tulsa was about taking away black wealth. We see this through housing. And what's really important is wealth is cumulative over an individual's lifetime, and wealth is also cumulative generationally. And so what we're seeing today is the cumulative generational impact in terms of wealth, of racial wealth gap that's built on the back of nearly a century of racist housing policies.
Wow. Now, what impact did those redlining maps of yesteryear, what impact does that have on today's current property values?
Well, I mean, I was just looking up, there's a couple of really interesting cases in the Hampton Roads region that you can look up, and I'll direct people to a project that I'm working with where we've just produced a bunch of maps where the viewer can kind of explore a digitized version of the 1940 redlining map overlaid with contemporary census data, and you can really see how these geographies line up really tightly. And that's on our project website. It's livingtogetherlivingapart.com, and I encourage folks to go there and have a look at the maps that we've created. But what we can see is there's some neighborhoods, and you can, anybody who wants can just look this up on Zillow. There's some neighborhoods that were one neighborhood was redlined today. The median home, the home value in that census tract is something in the neighborhood of $150,000 to $200,000, well below the state of Virginia's median home value. And just a couple of blocks away, home values are $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, and those align very tightly with neighborhoods that were 80 years ago redlined versus neighborhoods that had that highest ranking.
Wow, that's a big difference, a huge difference. I'm going to go right now to Sharon because I want her to share. She grew up in public housing. And Sharon, share a little bit about your experience and what you feel families go through that a lot of people just don't know, the real experiences of families in public housing.
Oh, I shall do that. So good afternoon again, and thank you for this invitation. And first, I wanted to just acknowledge what Dr. Rothstein said about how public housing was originated. And my parents came from North Carolina and entered into New York City public housing in 1957. So 10, 12 years when I was born, it was not as segregated as it is today. I can recall going to my neighbors who were Caucasian women and having coffee. And some of my neighbors were also Caucasian and some of the friends that I hung out with. But as time has progressed, we see that there was a shift in the change in the demographics that have been in public housing that you see a lot of it today. So my personal experience is that we have there's a sense of community in public housing, something that outsiders don't either acknowledge, value, or even identify. For the last 20 years, my research has been about how context matters, and so how living in public housing impacts people psychologically and physiologically, and the context in which people grow up, right? Not just the structural place, but the interaction and the ability to interact and socialize with people influences how people will grow up and develop, particularly youth. And one of the things that we focus on in my research is something called subjective neighborhood perception and then neighborhood cohesion. And so I can talk about this in those two ways. That there is one, a perception, a subjective perception, an understanding, a view of public housing by public housing residents. And that really talks about the structure of it, the physicality of it, how it's made up, what are some of the resources that are available to them in terms of parks or recreations or access to other place-based resources. And that perception varies from very positive ones that says we have what we need in our community to very negative things that says, there is a lack of resources and opportunities for residents here. And some of that is placed on the government and the policies, because policies dictate programs and services. On the positive side of that is subjective, it's neighborhood cohesion. So even when their perceptions are very negative about the community, they still feel a sense of cohesion with their neighbors because they feel they're in the same situation as each other, that they're fighting the same fight and they're advocating for the same resources. And so those are some of the experiences that I've identified with working with families in public housing. And there's a lot more that I can discuss and would like to have the opportunity to discuss, but I know we have a 1-hour show. So.
Yeah, it's a lot. This is a huge topic. And I'm wondering if Dr. Rothstein is still on. I had a question. Something that Sharon said when she was talking about her neighbors were not African. She was talking about she had white neighbors, and I before I go to Joe, I wanted to ask you about the whole white flight aspect because I know you touch on that in your book. You talk about I believe it's called blockbusting. Could you share a little bit about that aspect?
Sure. There are two aspects to the white flight phenomenon. Well, one is what you refer to as blockbusting, and that is that when an African-American family did move to a nearby white neighborhood. I mentioned earlier that it was sometimes easy for them to do that because they were willing to pay so much more for housing than whites were willing to pay for housing in the same neighborhood, simply because African Americans had such a small supply. So, contrary to popular myth, when African Americans moved into those neighborhoods, property values rose. They didn't decline because, as I say, black families were willing to pay more. But what frequently happened was once that first family or first couple of families moved into such a neighborhood and property values were rising as a result, speculators, frequently real estate agents, would go into that neighborhood and begin a program of panicking white neighbors into thinking that soon their property values would fall because of black families moving in. In some cases, one I quote in the book, a real estate agent bragged about how he organized burglaries in a neighborhood in which a couple of black families had moved in order to scare white families into selling below market value to the speculator so they could then resell it to higher market value to a black family. These real estate agents hired black women, to walk through the neighborhood pushing baby carriages. They hired young black men to drive through the neighborhood in convertibles with radios blasting, all designed to panic whites to sell to these speculators at below market value. Pretty soon, whites were persuaded that they had to leave or their properties would further decline in value. The communities became all black. This is what's referred to as blockbusting. But the other aspect of white flight is even more powerful, and that was an explicit policy, and you referred to this in your introduction, an explicit policy of the federal government to move all white families out of apartments in urban neighborhoods into single-family homes in all white suburbs. This was an explicit racial program of the federal government. It was subsidized white flight. African Americans were prohibited from taking advantage of the subsidies to move to single-family homes in the suburbs. As you mentioned, that later resulted in the enormous wealth gap that we have today between blacks and whites, because the homes that the white families were subsidized to buy by the federal government have appreciated in value over subsequent generations. Black families were prohibited from participating in this program. The entire suburbanization of the country was created on a racially explicit basis by this federal program. And that is really the primary cause of white flight. It was a subsidy of the federal government for whites only, explicitly racial, to leave cities into all white suburbs. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats at the federal government level. This was the action of explicit federal policy. It was written in the federal policy manual. The federal policy manual not only said that the federal government couldn't insure bank loans of developers who would build developments that would sell to African Americans. The manual even said that you couldn't insure a bank loan to a developer who was going to build an all-white development that was located near where African Americans were living, because, in the words of the federal policy manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That was explicit language in the federal policy manual. As I said earlier, this notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. We have segregation today because of explicit federal white flight policies and other policies designed to ensure segregation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richard Rothstein. Now, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the results of redlining with special guest, Dr. Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, Dr. Johnny Finn, Associate Professor of Geography at CNU, Dr. Sharon Alston with the NSU Department of Social Work, and Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Commissioner Joe Dillard Jr. I'm Another View producer Lisa Godley, filling in for Barbara Ham Lee. Please join the conversation at 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Joe Dillard, how are past wrongs being dealt with today?
That's a very good question. So I'm going to try to give it to you from the NRHA perspective. I think I was talking with you recently, Lisa, and I spoke on a book called Black, White, and Brown by Hap White in Norfolk that kind of explained about, and I'm going to use St. Paul's Quadrant, which is off of Tidewater Drive in Norfolk, as an example of how that was slums and ghettos before it became a project. And now with the redevelopment, I'm glad Dr. Rothstein said and spoke about white flight, because I think what we're experiencing now is that form of gentrification. And I believe in reading that book, the board that I'm with, Lisa, I think we're very dynamic. You have people from East Ocean View, different parts of the community. And when we come together, I think we have a dynamic to make sure that if another book is written about what's going on in our communities, that we're doing our part to try to change the wrongs of what was done yesterday. I know I've spoken with many people in the community in Norfolk, Rodney Jordan being one of them. There's still deeds today that are floating around that prevent white people from selling homes to black. It's not enforceable, but you can see the deed today. So there's still a lot of work to be done. There are a lot of things that we need to address, not just in the projects, but when we're talking about wealth. I know we were talking about wealth comparison. It's no happenstance that African Americans make up 1/10 of wealth compared to whites, and I think having these robust conversations and having these impactful dialogues will help us move forward to make sure that everyone's being, I don't think anyone wants a jump ahead. Everybody just wants a fair shot. And based on redlining and what we've already know and what we read, that's not the case right now. And then we're trying to do our part at NRHA to make sure that everyone has a fair shot.
Do you think the lines will actually change at this point, or are they kind of?
So for Norfolk, I don't think lines will change. I think in order to change those, you have to change the community that are within those lines. The reason I say that is because if you really take redlining, and I'm glad Dr. Flynn has said this earlier, I'm still using Norfolk as an example, Lisa. Before Ghent was Ghent, it was a black community. You didn't have to redline Ghent to get blacks out of there. You just had to gentrify it, correct? So when you start changing the dynamics of these communities, you don't have to change the lines drawn. But it's no secret, Lisa, that if I live in, and Dr. Flynn kind of alluded to this with housing markets, and I know Dr. Sharon knows this as well. If I live in St. Paul's Quadrant right now, my life expectancy is 20 years younger than a mile down the road in Ghent.
Wow.
You get what I'm saying? So the lining really doesn't matter. It's what you put in those communities. So are they going to put proper resources into the St. Paul's Quadrant? If we do tear down those projects, are we allowing African Americans to be in a position to buy homes and generate wealth to pass it down generation to generation? So redlining was definitely systematically set up to prevent things. But I think now in this generation, though those lines still exist, we can work within those lines to make that change in those communities.
Gotcha. Okay. Dr. Rothstein, what's your take on what we need to do today to turn things around?
Well, if you will permit me, first let me say that I'm not a doctor. I'm just a journalist, a historian.
Okay.
And I'm trying to tell a story about how this happened. Well, what we need today is a new civil rights movement that's going to make it as uncomfortable to maintain the unconstitutional policies of segregation, effects of those policies, as the civil rights movement of the 1960s made it uncomfortable to maintain policies of segregation that were also state and government directed in the areas of public transportation and public accommodations and voting rights and employment and so forth. The civil rights movement of the 1960s left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area is residentially segregated. We've had a wonderful resurgence of interest and awareness. We have more passionate and accurate discussion of the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow now in this country than we ever have had before in American history. We've had demonstrations about police abuse of African Americans, discriminatory treatment, sometimes even murders of African Americans. But we need to go beyond that to deal with the underlying cause of this abuse, the underlying cause of the health disparities that we just heard about, and that's the segregation of African Americans that was imposed by the federal government. So we do need a new civil rights movement. I'm hopeful it will emerge from the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and from these conversations that we've been having nationally about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. And that's the only way we're going to change it. We know what the policies to change it are. We don't need policy advice. What we need is a political movement that's going to insist that government implement the policies. Government made this segregation. It can unmake it quite easily, but it's going to require a new civil rights movement to force it to do so.
Do you think it will be difficult to change a mentality of people who have thought for a very long time that, well, if this person moves into my community, my property values are going down? There seems to be a mental, some people may be stuck that way. And I'm wondering how we address that part of it all.
Well, of course, it takes time for people's attitudes to change, but it's a mistake to think that attitudes have to change before we change reality. People's attitudes are also reflect reality. When many whites see African Americans living, so many African Americans living in slum conditions, it's understandable they can conclude that African Americans are slum dwellers and that their neighborhoods will become slums if African Americans move into them. If more whites begin to see African Americans not having to live in slum conditions, their attitudes will slowly change. So both have to happen. But we shouldn't assume that attitudes have to change first. Reality changes attitudes as much as attitudes change reality.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you, Joe. How do we change the look? What happens?
Oh, well, to piggyback on what you're saying as far as the social justice movement, changing the look is just basically having these robust conversations, really putting equity, as he's already said, the government made it so they can fix it. So these opportunity zones, quote unquote, that are being created, these Section 4 programs are putting money back into the communities that we're impacting. I think we have to take a greater stake in before we want to look at this new, vibrant, eco-friendly downtown. We want to make sure that those people that we're moving back in or allowing them to leave have the proper tools to expand. I think my biggest thing, Lisa, is when every African American is in public housing, or it doesn't even, and that's what I think, it's not even necessarily public housing. There's still active practices going on right now that keep African Americans from buying property, even if you have cash on hand. So when policies are really being implemented from the federal level down, to put some meat on the bone, to give us really a fighting chance. You know, I personally didn't inherit any property. I have friends that don't look like me that didn't have inherited multiple properties, you know. So, and to get it out the door, Lisa, they don't even teach you this in school. And I am the Norfolk guy, so I graduated from Norfolk Public Schools. This is not something that we were taught coming up, you know. And if your parents didn't know it, how are you supposed to know it, Lisa? You know, if you live in public housing and all you know is what's going on in public housing, how are you really supposed to know how to generate wealth or stop redlining or be able to be a homeowner? So it has to start from both sides, you know, the federal policies and what the government can do, and also getting into the classroom and starting there as well.
Wonderful. I see you shaking your head, Johnny. What? Go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I also wanted to make sure that we emphasize we're talking about housing and we've been talking about wealth. But there's a lot of kind of add-on impacts that have a kind of a long-term result of these segregationist and racist housing policies beyond wealth. There was a recent report in the Washington Post about a $23 billion school funding gap. That's nationally, and $23 billion per year go to predominantly white schools than to predominantly non-white schools. And then we've just run a bunch of analyses with a project that I'm working on here at Christopher Newport University. We've run a bunch of analyses looking at the environmental impacts of this segregation, linking directly the 1940 redlining map to things like food deserts and to EPA toxic release sites. And then just earlier this week, the New York Times ran an outstanding piece based on research done out of the Virginia Museum of Science, looking at urban heat and tracking how formerly redlined neighborhoods are many degrees hotter during the summer than the neighborhoods that receive the highest rating. And the New York Times piece was based on Richmond, and I've just kind of inspired by that, ran that same analysis for Hampton Roads, and it kind of links up tree cover, impervious surfaces, and urban heat. And you can see that according to the study done by the Virginia Museum of Science, in Norfolk, formerly redlined neighborhoods are on average 3 degrees hotter in the summer than the neighborhoods that formerly received the highest ranking. And so we see this kind of play out in terms of environmental justice and environmental injustice that then has direct links to health. So it's not just about wealth and income and economics, but it's also about the environment and about human health.
Okay, I remember reading in Richard's book about plants and landfills, and they were always put in zoning areas where there were African American communities were erected, and interstate. Well, we talked about the interstates, but how these areas were they were zoned so that these places that had would definitely be detrimental to your health would be erected. And it was just that was just amazing to me. I mean, I knew it, but to see it and to look at these different circumstances all around the country.
Yeah, and with some of that's exactly right. And with some of the technology that we're working with now, we can actually kind of measure the racial makeup of neighborhoods that are, say, within 1 kilometer of a toxic release site, compared to the racial makeup of the metropolitan area overall. And what we see when we look at different kinds of environmental harms, and you do those measures, the African Americans and other non-white populations are far overrepresented amongst the folks that are amongst the population that's in closest geographic proximity to these environmental harms, toxic release sites, interstate highways, and then this question of heat and impervious surfaces as well. So, yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Thank you so much. Please join the conversation. Our lines are open, 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Dr. Sharon Alston, go right ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to speak a little bit about what Dr. Rothstein said about what we need is another civil rights or social action, social justice. And I can't help to agree 100%. But what I also want to add to that statement is that policies are developed by people, but they're also implemented by social service agencies like the Housing Authority, like healthcare, like mental health services. And it is the people who are responsible for implementing the programs and services guided by these policies also have an obligation and responsibility to acknowledge the racial inequity that exists within those policies. And so how do we get these individuals who are responsible for implementing the policies into practices and services to acknowledge that and push back with those powers that be to say we need to do things differently for people in the community? The other thing is about the environmental justice and having African Americans and Black and Brown people be exposed or benefit from these new renovations. It's one thing to redevelop. It's another thing for African Americans and those who live in public housing to have access to that. And so while we are building new structures, we got beautiful buildings, we have great places to eat and look over across the waterfront. We have parks and trailways. But how many of African American individuals or those who have been relocated and will be relocated to other places, how much access will they have to those new amenities? And so as a result, people are being pushed back into other areas with racial segregation. They're being displaced both physically and culturally into areas where they have even less opportunity for place-based resources. And so it's yes, we have to organize. We have to include residents in the conversation. So when you think about how do we get rid of racial equity, so we think about racial equity, it is an outcome and it is also a process. And so as an outcome, it is that regardless of your race, your gender, your socioeconomic status, that you have access to these resources that help you thrive. And as a process is that we are engaging those who are most marginalized in the conversation about decisions that's going to govern what happens in the communities in which they will live. And until we can really do that authentically, that's going to be a challenge for us. So it cannot just be lip service that, yes, let's have a conversation with individuals. It has to be true, it has to be real, and it has to be effective, and it has to be authentic.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We have a call, David from Norfolk on line 2. David, go right ahead. You're on Another View.
Hello, Miss Godley. How you doing?
I'm great.
Okay, well, I thought I should weigh in on this. In 1969, my parents and my sister and I moved from Miami, Florida to here. And among other things, they threw dirt at the moving men because we were the first black family to move in the neighborhood. And we were initially not allowed to move into the house. It was September, and we were able to move there till January. And we ended up going to federal court over it. I only know bits and pieces, but it was one of the first major housing discrimination cases in the country, and it was all over the news. Stanley Stack represented us, and so I just wanted to bring that topic up because I thought it would be quite relevant to this conversation.
Thank you so much. Johnny, you want to?
Well, I think if we take what the caller said, I think we see that this is a long-term struggle. This is some segregation, as Mr. Rothstein was saying, is something that was made, it was generated, it was not by accident. And it's also, I think, with a lot of these discussions, important to remember that all along the way, people have not kind of passively gone along with it. They've been kind of struggling back against unfair, unjust, and racist systems. And I think we see from this call a perfect example of that.
Gotcha. I do want to ask Joe a question because of something that Sharon said earlier. I remember as years as a reporter years ago, whenever in different cities, even whenever a housing community would be demolished and it would be rebuilt, folks would disappear. We didn't know where they were going. We couldn't really track them. Maybe a couple would come back into the new housing facility, but we didn't know what happened to the bulk of the people. And I'm wondering, Joe, how Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing is addressing that particular situation.
Definitely. So we have this initiative, not just with NRHA, Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority is working with the city of Norfolk. We brought in USI after we got this grant, the CNI Community Neighborhood Initiative Grant, to redevelopment St. Paul's Quadrant. And our number one goal is kind of getting back to what Dr. Austin has alluded to. I think the board and NRHA's number one goal is each person that lives in that housing community will have a possibility to come back. They have a choice. Do you want to come back, Lisa, or do you not? And past practices with NRHA, and I'm pretty sure with any other housing authority, they make those false promises of we do one-for-one housing. And then when a Broad Creek comes up, there's no longer one-for-one housing, and those that wanted to come back are no longer able to come back. So I think right now with our board and working with the city, the St. Paul's footprint, I can speak for our board led by Don Masaccio and Alfonso Albert. And I know Dr. Sharon's also been involved with some things going on in NRHA. We're 100% committed to choice neighborhoods. I think the curveball is, and I have to say, I admit that I have fought in this too, Lisa. I always thought that everyone wants to come back, which is not the case. Of the 600 units that we're talking about, 130 of them might want to come back. Some people want to leave right now and go live in Florida because with some of these vouchers, Lisa, you can go anywhere in America. So my number one goal, and I think I can say this on behalf of the board, is those persons that will be affected have a choice. And if you choose that you want to come back to this new St. Paul's development or in the future anywhere of a Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority property, that's your choice. And we're not systematically doing what's been done in the past, not only in Norfolk, across the country. I'm pretty sure we could put any housing authority and they make these false promises. And then also with the vouchers, Lisa, the loophole for the government is you don't have to track those. So we can give someone a voucher right now in Norfolk and they can go live in Orlando, Florida, and we're really not tracking them because they're ported out of our system. So there's so many things that you can close, but I think on speaking on behalf of what we're doing in Norfolk, we want to make sure that we have that choice neighborhood or your choice. It's your choice what you want to do, those type of services. And I think that's kind of what you're alluded to earlier, asking me, what are we doing now differently than what we did in the past? And we're really, as a board, are trying to make sure we stand firm on choices for those people being affected in these communities.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's take another caller, Mark from Norfolk. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, good afternoon to you and your guests.
Good afternoon.
A friend of mine has a saying that his father used to tell him every day is work with what you got, make what you got work. And so, a lot of these conversations that we're having, it's just amazing that they're lasting so long. And really what it all comes down to is that we should be able to get the data analytics to show our depository strength amongst the African constituency in the United States, find out what is the big number, how that money is dispersed across the banks, and then basically say, hey, look, we don't have to ask for anything. We can demand what we need. Because to have any of those Treasury dollars shifted from one to the other is going to be cataclysmic. So what we need to do is work with what we got, make what we got work, leverage it, and let's change this and let's end the conversation.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Mark, for calling and sharing. We really appreciate that. While we still have Richard Rothstein on the line, I have a question for you, because I remember one thing that kind of stood out. We were talking so much about housing discrimination. One area that you touched on in your book was talking about job equity and the unions, and I would love for you to share a little of that with our listeners, if you would.
Sure. As I said, the wealth gap is enormous that was created by the subsidization of white families to move into homes that later appreciated. But there's an income gap as well, which also contributes to the ongoing impoverishment of many African American families. Today, African American incomes are about 60% on average, family average of white family incomes. African American wealth is about 5% of white family wealth, white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between the 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policies that were practiced in the mid-20th century. But the income ratio, the 60% income ratio, also has unconstitutional roots. In the 1930s, for example, the federal government not only first got involved in housing, but got involved much more in income policy than ever before. Occupations in which African Americans predominated, like agriculture, for example, were excluded from coverage under the Social Security Act. They were occupations in which African Americans predominated were excluded from minimum wage laws, the Fair Labor Standards Act of the 1930s, and the one you referred to, the National Labor Relations Act, permitted the federal government to certify for exclusive collective bargaining rights unions that prohibited African Americans from being members. This was an enormous exclusion. It meant that African Americans couldn't participate in many of the jobs that raised white incomes in the post-World War II period, construction jobs, for example. There were some unions, industrial unions like the United Auto Workers, that included African Americans, that were open and welcoming to African Americans, but many, many unions, like the construction trades, blue-collar jobs, that generated a lot of income, wealth for white workers, were prohibited to African Americans, and these income policies were also unconstitutional. It wasn't until the 1970s that the federal government began refusing to certify unions to that excluded African Americans from membership. This is recent history.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting, how some of the unions treated the African Americans, wanting them to pay dues, but they didn't really have any representation. How you touched on that in your book. Okay. All right. Johnny, what would you like to share? We're just about out of time, but what would you like to share and leave with our audience today?
Yeah, well, I think we have an interesting opportunity right now with the redevelopment in St. Paul's Quadrant in Norfolk, and a similar program going on in Newport News, where I'm located, with the redevelopment of the Marshall Ridley public housing in the Southeast community in Newport News. And I've characterized my position on this as optimistically pessimistic, because as Joe said, we've seen this movie before, right? We've seen these redevelopments going all the way back to the 1950s in Los Angeles, the famous redevelopment of Chavez Ravine, and the 1960s in Washington, D.C., and as recently as the 2000s in Chicago. And this movie, like I said, we've seen this movie before, and it kind of always ends the same way, and not in a good way. And that's why I tend to view this as pessimistic, but I hope and I trust that Joe and the folks in Norfolk are working to not repeat the challenges of urban renewal plans and urban redevelopment plans that have been repeated so many times in the past.
Okay. All right, Joe, you have a last word for us? You have about a minute.
I'm glad he said that. I think Dr. Fannin is speaking exactly how I feel. When I came on the board in 2017, Lisa, I was this anti-housing authority keepsake. I felt like everything the housing authority did was wrong in the past, and they'll continue to be wrong in the future. But I can say I think my board is a little bit more optimistic than I am, which is good, Dr. Finn, for us, because I still feel as though some practices need to be honed in. We're in the midst of a pandemic, and we're also trying to do one of the largest developments in public housing history, not just in Norfolk, but in history. So to make sure that we're pulling in the right people, Lisa, is going to be the right thing. Like I know Dr. Austin's been doing great work. So I think NRHA needs to partner with the city and others in the community to make sure that we're putting out the right information, but actually making a change and where the people in the community feel like they have ownership on it. And I think that helps us, Dr. Finn, when we get to the point at the end. It might not be that this picture that we painted, but it was everyone's input of getting there, where if we don't hit the mark or we don't hit the moon, we're still amongst the stars. So hopefully, Lisa, these conversations continue to happen. I think any board member, including myself in Norfolk, is open to discussion. We're here to hear ideas on how we can make sure that we don't continue past practices. So I'm just grateful to be here and have this conversation with you guys, and hope it continues to move forward.
Wonderful. Dr. Sharon Austin, you have the last 30 seconds.
Well, I would encourage you all to look at the literature. There's a lot of information about moving to opportunities and Hope 6, which is housing opportunities for people everywhere. There's a lot of information that says about what this past policies has done and impacted families in housing. I also encourage academics to do more research, not on communities, but with communities and for communities. And I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to my NSU students who are on the ground working really hard with me on my research on public housing. We're actually doing some work looking at Choice Neighborhoods Initiative and Hope 6. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you each and every one for what you shared today. Hopefully we've enlightened some folks that didn't know what was going on and just sharing a little bit of history and in an effort to move forward. Thank you all so very much. And thank you for spending your noonday hour with us. If you'd like to hear this show again, or share with a friend, please visit our website at anotherviewradio.org and download the podcast. While you're there, please sign up for our eView newsletter, a once-a-week reminder of upcoming programs. We're on Facebook, so like us, and I'm on Twitter at Godley, that's GODLEY_Lisa. Barbara will be back in the big chair next week, and her guest will be Dr. Eric Claville, creator of the award-winning Claville Report, and they'll be discussing the conventions and the 2020 election. Our theme music was composed by Jay Sennett, and a big thank you to Paul Bibot, who graciously filled in for me. Todd Washburn, our audio engineer. I'm Lisa Godley. Thank you so much for sharing your noonday hour with Another View.